The train exhaled a long, weary sigh of steam, its iron lungs settling after the hard pull across the Nevada desert. On the raw timber platform of Redemption Creek, Alistair Vance checked his pocket watch for the third time. He was a man tailored in worry, his suit a shade too dark for the blistering summer of 1878, his face pinched with the expectation of a fragile treasure. He had paid for a wife, a delicate china doll pictured in a letter, a woman whose small frame promised thrift and obedience. But the woman who stepped from the passenger car was not delicate. She wore a plain white prairie dress, the fabric straining slightly across her shoulders and hips, a testament to a long journey and a constitution built for more than just looking pretty. Her face, broad and open, was flushed from the heat, her black hair pulled into a simple, thick knot at the nape of her neck. She was not a doll. She was a woman, solid and real, her eyes scanning the small crowd with a calm and hopeful curiosity. She clutched a single, heavy canvas bag. Vance's face went from pinched to appalled. He took a half step back, as if struck. The woman's gaze found him, her expression brightening with recognition from the photograph he had sent. She gave a small, formal bow. "Mr. Vance?" she said, her voice lower and richer than the tinkling bell he had imagined. He did not answer. He simply stared, his mouth a thin, pale line. The station master, a grizzled man named Peters, ambled over. "This the party you're waiting on, Mr. Vance?" Vance finally found his voice, a strangled, indignant thing. "That is not the woman from the letters. There has been a mistake, a deception." He turned his glare on her, his words sharp and loud for all the loiterers on the platform to hear. "I sent passage for the woman in the photograph, a respectable, slender woman, not this." He gestured vaguely at her, his hand waving away her entire presence, as if she were a puff of unpleasant smoke. The woman, whose name was Fenn, felt the hope in her chest turn to a cold, heavy stone. Her limited English was enough to catch the sting of his words, the public disgust. Her gaze dropped to the dusty planks of the platform. Across the street, leaning against the shadowed facade of the Mercantile, Silas Blackwood pushed his hat back an inch. He had come to town for salt and coffee, a trip he made only a few times a year from his small, lonely homestead carved out of the sagebrush hills. He was a quiet man by nature and by choice, his face weathered by sun and wind, his movements slow and deliberate. He observed the unfolding cruelty with a familiar ache. He had seen men like Vance before, men who measured the world in what it owed them. Vance was now arguing with the station master. "She is to be sent back on the next train east. I will not be made a fool of. I will not accept damaged goods." "Next train ain't for 3 days, Mr. Vance," Peters said, scratching his neck. "And she's got a paid ticket one way. What happens to her till then ain't the railroad's concern." The argument was a magnet, pulling in the town's idle and curious. Whispers spread like wildfire, painting Finn as a trickster, a heavy-set charlatan who had tried to swindle one of Redemption Creek's most prominent citizens. Vance, basking in the sudden sympathy, puffed out his chest. He saw himself as the victim, a good man wronged. He did not see the woman standing alone, the white of her dress a stark beacon of her isolation, her entire world shrunk to a canvas bag and a patch of splintered wood. Silas watched her hands. They were clasped in front of her, still and steady. She did not weep. She did not plead. She simply stood, absorbing the humiliation with a stillness that was more powerful than any outcry. It was that stillness that snagged his attention. It spoke not of weakness, but of a deep, contained strength. He saw the quiver in her jaw, the only sign of the storm raging within her. He knew what would happen next. No hotel would take her. No decent family would offer shelter. She was a pariah before she had even set foot on the town's dusty main street. Vance would see to that. He would poison the well so thoroughly that she would have no choice but to beg, to become the desperate creature he was painting her as. Silas pushed himself off the wall. The movement was slight, but it felt momentous. He was not a man who interfered. His life was built on the principle of keeping his head down and his heart to himself. But there was a line, and Alistair Vance, with his polished boots and rotten soul, had just strode right over it. The injustice was a burr under his saddle, a sharp stone in his boot. He did not know what he was going to do, or what he could even offer. He only knew he could not stand by and watch this happen. He started walking across the street, his spurs kicking up little puffs of dust, each step a quiet rebellion against the man he used to be. She did not yet know it, but the quiet cowboy moving toward her was the only thing standing between her and utter ruin. The crowd parted for Silas, not out of respect, but out of a mild curiosity. He was a known quantity in Redemption Creek, the solitary rancher who kept to himself, paid his bills in cash, and never said 2 words when one would do. His approach was unexpected. He stopped a few feet from Finn, ignoring the hostile glares from Vance and his newfound supporters. He addressed the station master, his voice a low rumble. "Mr. Peters?" "Silas," Peters acknowledged, surprised. "The lady needs a place to stay," Silas said, his eyes on Finn. He did not look at her as Vance had, with judgment and disgust. He looked at her the way he looked at a skittish new foal, with a quiet patience that offered safety without demanding trust. Vance scoffed, stepping forward. "This is none of your affair, Blackwood. This woman is a fraud. She is to be sent back where she came from." "She's a person, not a parcel," Silas replied, his gaze finally shifting to Vance. The look was flat, without heat, but it carried a weight that made Vance's bluster falter for a second. "And she's standing in the sun. She needs water and shade." It was the simplest of observations, yet it cut through the moral outrage of the crowd. It reminded them that beneath the scandal was a human being, hot and tired and 1,000 miles from home. Fenn looked up at him, her dark eyes wide with cautious surprise. He was tall and lean, his clothes worn but clean, his face a map of sun and hardship. He was not handsome in the way Vance was, with his soft hands and manicured mustache. Silas's presence was something else entirely. It was solid, like the mountains that rimmed the valley. "I can't have her in the station house," Peter said, already backing away from the conflict. "Wife wouldn't abide it." "And she's not welcome at the hotel," Vance declared, regaining his footing. "I've already spoken to the proprietor. This town protects its own." The invisible walls of the community closed in around Fenn. She could feel their judgment, a physical pressure. Silas saw the subtle shift in her posture, the way her shoulders drooped a fraction of an inch. He had a 1-room cabin and a horse. He had no place for a woman, no way to house her that wouldn't set tongues wagging even more fiercely. But there was the old mission, a day's ride east. It was abandoned, but the stone walls were sound, and there was a spring nearby. It was a place to breathe. "I'm riding east," Silas said, his decision made. "I can take her as far as the old San Pedro mission. She can wait for the next wagon train there. It's better than this." He gestured at the gawking crowd. Fenn understood only a fraction of the words, but she understood the offer. This stranger was offering an escape. She looked from his steady gaze to Vance's sneering face, and the choice was not a choice at all. She gave Silas a short, determined nod. "She's not going anywhere with you," Vance sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. He saw his narrative slipping away. He needed her to be a destitute beggar, not a woman under someone's protection. "She owes me for her passage, $200. The sum was astronomical, more than a man like Silas was likely to see in a year. The crowd murmured. It was a debt, a legal and binding thing. Silas's jaw tightened. He didn't have that kind of money. Not here, not now. But he also knew a bluff when he saw one. He doubted Vance had the paperwork to prove such a debt, but the accusation itself was a cage. "You can send a bill to my homestead," Silas said calmly, calling the bluff. "Now, if you'll excuse us." He reached down, and with a gentleness that seemed out of place for his calloused hands, he took Fenn's heavy bag. He didn't touch her. He simply took the burden from her. For the first time since stepping off that train, someone had offered to share her load. He turned and started walking toward the livery stable, not looking back to see if she was following. He trusted that she would. Fenn hesitated for only a heartbeat, then she straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and followed the quiet cowboy, leaving Alistair Vance standing speechless and furious in the middle of the platform. The walk across town was a gauntlet of silent stares and hostile whispers. But with Silas's broad back in front of her, The stairs seemed to lose some of their power.
What she did not know was that in that moment, Silas Blackwood had just spent every ounce of social goodwill he had ever accumulated in Redemption Creek, and the cost of his quiet decency was only beginning to be tallied. The ride out of town was silent. Silas led his pack mule, laden with his supplies, while Finn rode his steady bay mare Bess. He had adjusted the stirrups for her without a word, his movements efficient and respectful. She sat the horse better than he had expected, her back straight, her hands light on the reins. They left the dusty scar of Redemption Creek behind, disappearing into the vast, shimmering expanse of the high desert. The sun was a hammer, but a dry breeze offered some relief. For hours, the only sounds were the plod of hooves on dusty ground and the creak of saddle leather.
Silas pointed out landmarks in a low voice. Alkali Flats. Don't drink the water there. That's Granite Peak. Snow on it, even in summer. Finn would nod, her eyes taking in the stark, powerful landscape. It was so different from the crowded, green province she had left. This land was empty and immense, beautiful and terrifying all at once. It did not seem like a place for a person to be alone. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the horizon, they reached the ruins of the old mission. The adobe walls were crumbling, the roof of the main chapel long gone, but a small outbuilding, perhaps the old rectory, was mostly intact. A spring bubbled up from under a cluster of cottonwoods, creating a small, miraculous patch of green. Silas set about making a camp with practiced economy. He unsaddled the horse, watered her at the spring, and started a small fire. He did it all with a quiet focus that Finn found herself watching, mesmerized.
He moved like a man who was at home in the silence, who didn't need words to fill the space. He offered her a tin cup of water from the spring. She took it, her fingers brushing his. The touch was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt of warmth through her. She murmured, "Thank you." "You're welcome," he said, his gaze holding hers for a moment before he turned back to the fire. He cooked bacon and beans in a small skillet, and they ate from tin plates, sitting on opposite sides of the crackling flames. The silence was different now, no longer the tense quiet of the ride, but something more comfortable, companionable. Finally, Finn spoke. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in silk. She carefully unwrapped it to reveal a stack of letters and a small, exquisitely carved wooden bird. She handed the letters to him. They were from Vance. Silas wiped his hands on his trousers and took them. He read them by the flickering firelight.
They were full of flowery promises and careful instructions. He wrote of his prosperous ranch, his standing in the community, his desire for a wife to share in his good fortune. But reading between the lines, Silas saw the truth. Vance wasn't looking for a partner. He was hiring an unpaid servant. He mentioned the need for a woman with a strong back for the garden, one who knew how to manage a kitchen for ranch hands, one who would not be a frivolous expense. The photograph he'd sent of himself was 10 years old. The one he'd requested of her was meant to be a guarantee of a meek and manageable constitution. He looked up from the letters, a new understanding dawning. He wasn't just looking for a wife. Finn shook her head. She pointed to a line in one of the letters, then held up 3 fingers. 3 sons, she said, her voice soft, to work farm. My father, he think this good life for me, better than home. She looked down at her hands. But Mr. Vance, he see me, and he see too much woman, not enough worker. The words, though broken, painted a clear, heartbreaking picture. She was not a mail-order bride in the typical sense. This was a business arrangement between her father and Vance, a transaction meant to secure her future. Her size, which Vance had seen as a flaw, was meant to be a sign of her health and strength, her capacity for the hard work he described. But Vance, a man of vanity, had wanted the fantasy of a delicate flower and the labor of a draft horse, all in one. When faced with the reality of a real, substantial woman, his pride had curdled into cruelty. Silas handed the letters back to her. His loss, he said, the 2 words carrying more weight than a whole speech. She then showed him the small wooden bird, its wings half spread as if about to take flight. For luck, she said, placing it on a stone near the fire. He saw the fine, detailed work of the carving, the patience in every smooth curve. He looked from the bird to her hands, which he now realized were not just strong, but skilled. She was an artist. She was a woman who created beautiful things. She was so much more than the sum of Alistair Vance's bitter disappointment. A cold knot of anger tightened in Silas's gut. The man hadn't just rejected her, he had refused to see her at all. He had looked at this capable, dignified woman and seen only a reflection of his own shallow vanity. The sound of hoofbeats approaching in the dark startled them both. Silas was on his feet in an instant, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle propped against his saddle. 2 riders emerged from the gloom, their forms backlit by the rising moon. It was Vance, and with him was the town's part-time sheriff, a man named Miller, who was known to be squarely in Vance's pocket. "Blackwood," Vance called out, his voice dripping with smug triumph. "I told you this wasn't over. I've come to collect what's owed." Sheriff Miller shifted in his saddle, the star on his chest glinting. "Mr. Vance has filed a formal complaint, Silas, claiming this woman is his indentured servant until the debt for her passage is paid. $200. You either pay it, or I'm taking her back to town to be held in his custody." The trap had been sprung. It wasn't a bluff after all. It was a legal cage, and they were standing right in the middle of it. Silas looked at Finn. Her face was pale in the firelight, but her eyes were fixed on him, not with fear, but with a quiet, waiting trust. He had brought her here to give her a moment of peace, and instead, he had led her right into the wolf's den. To stand with her now would mean making an enemy of a powerful man and the law he controlled. To abandon her would be to break the unspoken promise he'd made when he picked up her bag. Silas took a slow breath, the cool night air doing little to quell the fire in his chest. He had lived his life on the sidelines, but he was done watching. "She's not for sale, Vance," Silas said, his voice dangerously quiet. "She already is," Vance sneered, "and I hold the note. Pay up or step aside." Sheriff Miller cleared his throat, a sound of manufactured authority. "It's the law, Silas. You know I have to enforce it." Silas knew Miller's version of the law was whatever Vance paid for. Arguing was pointless. He looked at Fenn, who stood by the fire, the small wooden bird clutched in her hand. He thought of the $200 he had painstakingly saved, burying it in a tin can under the floorboards of his cabin. It was his safety net, the sum total of 5 years of brutal work and sacrifice. It was for a new well, for seed, for surviving a bad winter. It was his future. He looked back at Vance's smug, expectant face. Giving him that money was more than a financial loss. It was letting the man win. It was validating his cruelty, paying him for his own rotten character. But then he looked at Fenn again. He saw not a problem or a debt, but the woman who had faced public humiliation with quiet dignity, the woman whose hands could carve hope out of a block of wood. Her freedom was worth more than any well. "I'll pay it," Silas said, the words tasting like ash. He turned to Miller. "You can ride with me to my homestead in the morning. I'll give you the money. In return, I want a bill of sale, marked paid in full, and a document signed by you as sheriff, stating that Miss Fenn is a free woman, with no debts or obligations to Mr. Vance or anyone else in this territory." Vance's jaw dropped. He had not expected this. He had expected a fight or a surrender, but not this quiet, absolute defeat of his plan. Miller looked surprised too, but he nodded slowly. A legal document was a legal document. "That seems fair," the sheriff allowed. Vance, robbed of his power play, turned his fury on Fenn. "You think you've won? You're throwing yourself away on a dirt-poor rancher with nothing to his name. You'll be begging in the streets by winter." Before Silas could respond, Fenn took a step forward. She looked directly at Vance, her gaze clear and unwavering. "I am not a thing to be won," she said, her English slow but precise. "And a life of hard work with an honest man is better than a life of ease with a liar." The words struck Vance with the force of a physical blow. He stared at her, speechless, seeing for the first time not a body, but a mind, and a will as strong as iron. He had been so focused on her shape that he had never once considered her character. He spun his horse around and rode off into the darkness, defeated not by Silas's money, but by Fenn's truth. Miller lingered for a moment. "I'll meet you at your place tomorrow around noon, Silas." Then he, too, was gone. The silence that returned was profound. The fire crackled, the wooden bird sat on its stone, and two people from different worlds stood under the vast starry sky, bound together by a debt that was now paid and a promise that was just beginning. Silas looked at the money he had just lost, and then at the woman he had just protected, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he had just made the best trade of his life. He walked over to the fire and gently took the wooden bird from her hand, his fingers closing over hers for a second longer than necessary. In the quiet of the desert, a new kind of future began to take shape. 6 months later, the first snows were dusting the high peaks. The wind that whipped across Silas's homestead was sharp with the promise of winter, but inside the small, sturdy cabin, a fire burned bright and warm. The cabin itself was changed. The single room was now neatly divided by a calico curtain, affording a measure of privacy. The shelves, once nearly bare, were now lined with jars of preserved vegetables from a garden that had defied the dry soil, thriving under Fenn's patient, knowledgeable hands. Silas had been right about her. Her skill was not just in carving wood. She had a deep, instinctual understanding of the land, of what would grow and where. She had turned his dusty patch of earth into a small, productive miracle. They had worked side by side through the long, hot summer and the crisp autumn, their shared labor a language that transcended their different tongues. He had taught her the rhythm of the ranch, and she had taught him the patience of the garden.
Sheriff Miller had come as promised, collected the $200, and delivered the signed document declaring Fenn a free woman. The town of Redemption Creek had kept its distance, treating Silas with a cool disapproval when he rode in for supplies. But he didn't care. The solitude he had once merely tolerated, he now cherished, for it was no longer empty. That evening he came in from the barn, shaking the cold from his coat. Fenn was sitting by the fire, mending one of his shirts. The white dress she had arrived in was long gone, cut up for cleaning rags and patches. She now wore a simple dress of dark blue wool, a garment she had sewn herself. She looked up as he entered, a small, quiet smile gracing her lips. Their communication was still a mix of his simple words and her growing English, but they understood each other perfectly. He had come to know the meaning of every glance, every gesture.
He knew the soft look in her eyes meant she was content. The slight furrow in her brow meant she was worried about the cattle. The quick, efficient way she moved meant she had a plan. He walked over to the hearth and knelt beside her, holding his hands out to the warmth. He watched her fingers, so strong and deft, as she pushed the needle through the worn fabric of his shirt. "Cold out," he said. "Snow is coming," she replied, not looking up from her work. "The sky says so." He had learned to trust her reading of the sky. He reached out and gently touched her cheek. Her skin was warm from the fire. She stopped her sewing and leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a moment. It was a gesture of complete trust, of absolute comfort. He had spent his life building walls around his heart, and this quiet, resilient woman had dismantled them without even trying, simply by being herself. He saw her now, truly saw her, not as the world did, but as the masterpiece she was, strong, capable, and beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with size or shape, and everything to do with the steady, gentle light that shone from within. He leaned in, and she lifted her face to his. His kiss was as quiet and deliberate as everything else about him. It was not a kiss of fiery passion, but of deep, abiding tenderness. It tasted of wood smoke and winter and the promise of a shared future. It was a kiss that said, "You are home," and "I am home." When he pulled back, her eyes were shining. She set aside the shirt she was mending and took his calloused hand in hers, lacing her fingers through his. Outside, the wind howled its lonely song, but inside the small cabin, two people sat together in the warm, golden light of the fire, their silence filled with all the things that no longer needed to be said. They had found in each other not a solution to their loneliness, but a partner to share it with, turning a desolate patch of earth into a place of belonging.